The living room was quiet, except for the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. The air felt heavy, as if even the house was mourning. On the mantel, a carefully folded American flag rested beside a framed photograph of a young soldier in uniform. Medals and ribbons, polished to a shine, stood next to the picture, silent witnesses to a life cut short. The mother sat on the couch, her hands wrapped around a worn notebook that once belonged to her son. Her fingers traced the edges of the pages as she whispered stories from his childhood, her voice trembling with equal parts sorrow and pride. "He always wanted to serve," she said softly, her eyes distant. "Even as a little boy, he'd say, 'Mom, one day I'll make you proud.' And he did. He made us so proud." The father sat beside her, his hands clasped tightly together, his gaze fixed on the floor. The weight of grief sat heavily on his broad shoulders. Across the room, the soldier's younger sister stared at the framed photograph, her heart aching with questions that would never be answered. Then, the phone rang. The sudden sound cut through the stillness, making everyone flinch. The father rose slowly, his movements deliberate, as if even this small act took great effort. He picked up the receiver, his voice low and measured. "Hello?" There was a pause, and then his posture stiffened. "Yes, this is him," he said, his tone shifting from weary to alert. The mother glanced up, her brow furrowed with concern. The sister leaned forward, sensing the change in the room. The father's grip on the phone tightened as he listened, his expression a mix of disbelief and confusion. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" The words that followed made his knees nearly buckle. "This is Donald Trump," the voice on the other end said. "I wanted to call personally to honor your son and express my deepest gratitude for his sacrifice." The mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The sister's eyes widened as she whispered, "Is that real? Is it really him?" The father nodded slowly, his voice thick as he replied, "Yes, Mr. President, we're honored." Trump's voice carried a weight of sincerity as he continued, "Your son's bravery and dedication to this country are things we should never forget. I would like to invite your family to a private ceremony in Washington, D.C., to properly honor his service." The family exchanged stunned glances, their emotions teetering between disbelief and an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The father managed to stammer a thank you, his voice cracking under the strain of holding back tears. As the call ended, the room fell silent once more. But this time it was a different kind of silence, one filled with anticipation, pride, and a glimmer of something they hadn't felt in months: hope. The morning of their departure arrived with a quiet gravity. The family's modest home, once filled with the soldiers' laughter and energy, now felt like a sacred space holding memories too precious to leave behind. As the father carefully packed a small bag, the mother stood at the mantel, her trembling fingers grazing the folded American flag and the framed photo of her son in uniform. She slipped his dog tags into her pocket, the cool metal a bittersweet comfort. Neighbors gathered outside to bid them farewell, their faces a mixture of pride and sorrow. One elderly man, a veteran himself, placed a firm hand on the father's shoulder. "Your son was a hero," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He made this town proud." A young boy handed the mother a bouquet of freshly picked flowers. "My dad said your son saved lives," he said shyly, his words heavy with understanding beyond his years. The mother managed a small smile, her tears glistening as she whispered, "Thank you." As the family boarded the train to Washington, the hum of the engine and the gentle sway of the car offered a strange kind of solace. The younger sister, no older than 16, sat by the window, her reflection overlapping the passing countryside. She clutched a small journal where she had written letters to her brother, her thumb tracing the edges of its worn cover. Her promise lingered in her mind. "I'll make you proud, big brother." The mother sat beside her, holding the dog tags tightly in her palm. As she stared out the window, her mind drifted to the last time she saw her son. His uniform had been crisp, his smile bright, and his words unwavering. "Mom," he had said, his voice steady, "I'll be back before you know it. Take care of everyone for me." Tears slid silently down her cheeks, and she clutched the dog tags closer. The father, seated across from them, glanced up, his own grief etched deeply into his face. Reaching over, he placed a reassuring hand on his wife's, their shared sorrow unspoken but understood. As the train approached Washington, the atmosphere inside the car shifted. The towering buildings of the city came into view, their imposing silhouettes a reminder of the significance of the trip. When the train pulled into the station, the family stepped onto the platform, their breaths catching as they spotted a man in a sharp black suit holding a sign with their name. "Welcome to Washington, D.C., the man said warmly, his voice steady and respectful. "We're honored to have you here. Please follow me." The family was escorted to a waiting black SUV, its polished exterior gleaming under the midday sun. Inside, the silence was heavy with anticipation as the city blurred past the windows. The father gripped his wife's hand tightly, while the younger sister gazed out at the unfamiliar streets, her heart pounding. When the vehicle finally stopped outside a grand building adorned with flags, the family exchanged nervous glances. The mother held her son's dog tags tightly, the sister clutched her journal, and the father straightened his posture. They stepped out of the car, their hearts heavy with grief, but lifted by the promise of what lay ahead. Uncertain of what awaited them, they followed the guide inside, the weight of their journey and their son's memory steadying their every step. The family was led down a long corridor, the soft echoes of their footsteps resonating against the marble walls. The guide stopped in front of a grand wooden door, its brass handle gleaming under the warm light. He turned to the family, his voice low and respectful. "They're ready for you inside." The father reached for the door, pausing briefly to exchange a glance with his wife. She nodded, her grip tightening on the dog tags in her hand. The younger sister stood close to her mother, clutching her journal as if it were a shield against the overwhelming emotions swirling inside her. The door opened to reveal a beautifully adorned room. The walls were lined with flags, their vibrant colors contrasting with the solemn atmosphere. At the center stood Donald Trump, flanked by a small group of officials. His expression was not the one often seen in public. It was warm, sincere, and tinged with solemnity. As the family entered, Trump stepped forward, his hand extended. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice steady and full of respect. He shook the father's hand firmly, then turned to the mother, his gaze softening. "Mrs. Taylor, I cannot imagine the pain your family has endured, but I want you to know that your son's bravery and sacrifice will never be forgotten." The mother's lips quivered as tears welled in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Trump knelt slightly to meet the younger sister's gaze, offering a gentle smile. "Your brother was a hero," he said, "and I know he'd be incredibly proud of you." The girl blinked rapidly, her hands gripping the journal tighter. "I miss him every day," she admitted, her voice cracking. Trump nodded, his own expression growing somber. "And every day, we will honor his memory." He led them to a table where a framed commendation sat, the gold lettering catching the light. "This is a recognition of your son's extraordinary service," Trump explained, carefully presenting it to the father. Next, he handed the mother a personalized letter, written in his own hand, expressing gratitude for their son's ultimate sacrifice. "And this," he continued, turning to the younger sister, "is a scholarship in your brother's name. It's for you to pursue your dreams, just as he would have wanted." The girl's breath hitched as she took the certificate. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered, "Thank you." The mother, unable to contain her emotions, broke down. Trump stepped forward, taking her hands gently in his. "Your son's sacrifice will always be remembered," he said firmly. "He gave everything for this country, and his legacy will live on." The room fell silent as the mother wept openly, her grief mingled with pride. The officials around them bowed their heads in respect, their own emotions visible. After a moment, Trump took a step back and said, "But there's one more thing I'd like to do." The family exchanged puzzled glances, the weight of anticipation growing heavy in the room. The father cleared his throat. "What do you mean, Mr. President?" Trump's expression softened further, and he gestured toward the door. "Follow me," he said. "I want to show you how we're ensuring your son's sacrifice is remembered, not just today, but for generations to come." With that, the family, their emotions raw but hearts swelling with gratitude, followed him toward what promised to be an unforgettable tribute. The family followed Trump down a quiet pathway lined with blooming magnolias, their footsteps muffled by the soft gravel underfoot. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the manicured grounds. Despite the serene beauty surrounding them, their hearts were heavy with anticipation. The mother clutched her son's dog tags, her fingers trembling, while the father walked beside her, his jaw tight as he held back his emotions. The younger sister trailed closely, her journal pressed tightly to her chest. Trump stopped near a gated entrance, the intricate ironwork bearing the crest of the armed forces. He turned to the family, his expression solemn but kind. "I wanted to create something that would ensure your son's bravery is remembered, not just by you, but by everyone." He pushed the gate open, revealing a small memorial garden. At its center stood a polished stone plaque, the dark granite reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. Engraved in bold, elegant lettering were the soldier's name, rank, and a heartfelt inscription. "In honor of Name, who gave the ultimate sacrifice for his country, a hero who will never be forgotten." The family froze, their breaths catching in their throats. The mother let out a soft sob, her knees buckling slightly as she took in the sight. The father reached out to steady her, his own tears spilling over as he read the words aloud. "A hero who will never be forgotten," he whispered, his voice breaking. The younger sister stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. She reached out, her fingertips grazing the cool surface of the plaque. Her lips quivered as she whispered, "You're a hero, big brother. You always were." Trump stood a few steps behind them, his hands clasped in front of him as he allowed the family their moment. The quiet strength in his demeanor reflected his deep respect for the sacrifice they had endured. He watched as the mother knelt beside the plaque, her tears falling freely now, her hand pressed against the engraving as if trying to reach through the stone to her son. A gentle breeze rustled the trees, and then, from a distance, the hauntingly beautiful sound of a trumpet playing taps began to fill the air. The mournful notes seemed to carry the weight of every unspoken word, every memory, every sacrifice. The family stood still, their grief and pride blending into something indescribable, something only they could feel. As the last note lingered in the air, Trump stepped forward and placed a hand on the father's shoulder. "Your son's sacrifice was not in vain," he said, his voice low and filled with emotion. "He will inspire others to serve, to honor, and to remember." The father nodded, his tears falling freely now. "Thank you," he managed, his voice thick. "This means more than you could ever know." Trump stepped back, giving the family space. As they knelt together in front of the plaque, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the memorial in a soft, golden glow. It was a moment of profound connection between the family, their son's memory, and a nation that would never forget his sacrifice. After the family spent a quiet, tearful moment at the memorial, they were guided back into the building. This time the atmosphere was different, more intimate, as though the gravity of the tribute had softened the air around them. They were led to a small, warmly lit room where comfortable chairs and a coffee table replaced the grandeur of the previous setting. On the table sat a tray of tea, water, and small snacks. Donald Trump entered a moment later, his demeanor gentler now, as though he too had been moved by the memorial. "Please sit," he said, gesturing toward the chairs. The family hesitated, then lowered themselves into the seats, the mother still clutching her son's dog tags tightly. For a moment, there was silence, filled only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. Then Trump leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet but firm. "I wanted to take a moment to hear about your son, from you. Tell me who he was, what he dreamed about, what made him laugh." The mother blinked, surprised by the question. She had expected a formality, not an invitation to share her son's story. Her lips quivered as she glanced at her husband, who nodded gently, encouraging her to speak. He was always so full of life," she began, her voice trembling. "Even as a little boy, he was the kind of person who could light up a room. He loved baseball, and he'd always talk about being a firefighter one day, until he decided he wanted to serve his country instead." The father picked up where she left off, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "He was brave. Even when he was scared, he never let it show. When he left for deployment, he hugged us all and said, 'I'll be back before you know it.'" His voice broke on the last word, and he took a shaky breath. The younger sister, who had been silent until now, wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. "He used to call me his kiddo," she said softly. "Every letter he sent me started with, 'How's my favorite kiddo doing?' I still have them all. She opened her journal, revealing a stack of folded letters tucked inside. Trump listened intently, his expression one of genuine empathy. "It's people like your son who make this country strong," he said after a moment. "Not just because of their courage, but because of the love they inspire in others. You raised a remarkable man." Turning to the younger sister, Trump's tone became softer. "And you, kiddo," he said, using her brother's term, "you have an incredible legacy to carry forward. Whatever dreams you have, pursue them. Honor him by living the fullest life you can." The girl nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'll try," she whispered. As the conversation wound down, the family seemed lighter, as though sharing their memories had lifted some of the weight they carried. Trump stood, placing a hand on the father's shoulder. "Your son's story deserves to be heard by everyone," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "And I'd like to share it in a way that will honor him and inspire others." The family exchanged curious glances. "What do you mean?" the mother asked cautiously. Trump smiled faintly. "I'll explain soon," he said. "But for now, just know that this is only the beginning of his legacy." With that, the room fell silent again, filled with a sense of hope and anticipation for what was yet to come. The family sat quietly in the intimate room, the weight of their emotions still raw from sharing their son's story. The atmosphere was heavy but not oppressive. Grief had begun to mix with pride, creating a fragile sense of peace. Donald Trump leaned forward, his voice gentle yet filled with conviction. "I want to tell you what's next." The father, his hands still clasped tightly on his lap, looked up. "Next?" he asked cautiously. The mother glanced at him, her fingers brushing against the dog tags in her hand. The younger sister, now calmer but with her journal still cradled in her arms, tilted her head in curiosity. Trump nodded. "Your son's bravery is something the world needs to know about, not just as a fallen hero, but as someone who embodied the values that make this country great. I want to share his story at an upcoming veterans event. It will be a moment to honor his sacrifice and ensure that his legacy inspires others." The room fell silent. The family exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of surprise and disbelief. "You mean his name will be spoken at a national event?" the mother asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," Trump replied firmly. "Not just his name, his story, his courage, his love for his family and his country. It's a legacy that deserves to live on, not just in your hearts, but in the hearts of everyone." The mother's tears began to flow again, this time not out of grief but out of overwhelming gratitude. "He would have been so proud," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He always wanted to make a difference." The father's voice was thick with emotion as he said, "We don't know how to thank you for this. It's more than we could have ever imagined." Trump shook his head, his expression unwavering. "This isn't about thanks. This is about honoring someone who gave everything. It's the least we can do." The younger sister, her cheeks wet with tears, looked up at him. "Why did you do all this for us?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Trump paused, his gaze meeting hers directly. "Because your son represents the best of us," he said simply. "He gave everything for a cause greater than himself, and his story deserves to be told. People like him remind us what it means to serve, to sacrifice, and to love without limits." The girl nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and longing. Her brother's legacy was no longer just a memory, it was becoming something far greater. As the family prepared to leave, Trump rose and extended his hand to the father. "This is only the beginning," he said. "We'll stay in touch. Your family's strength and your son's sacrifice will always be remembered." The father shook his hand firmly, his eyes glistening. "Thank you, Mr. President," he said, his voice filled with emotion. As they walked out of the room, their steps felt lighter. The promise of sharing their son's story gave them a new sense of purpose, a way to honor him in a way they hadn't imagined. And as the mother clutched the dog tags one last time, she whispered, "He'd be so proud." Months had passed since the private ceremony, but the memory of that day remained vivid in the family's hearts. They had returned home with a sense of purpose, their grief tempered by the knowledge that their son's sacrifice would not be forgotten. Today, they found themselves in Washington, D.C. once again, this time for an event that promised to immortalize his legacy. The Veterans Hall was vast, filled with rows of chairs that extended toward a grand stage adorned with flags and banners. The family sat in the front row, their emotions oscillating between pride and the ache of absence. The mother clutched her son's dog tags tightly, as she had on the day they first shared his story. The father sat beside her, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze steady but distant. The younger sister, now a little more confident, held her journal close, its pages filled with memories of her brother. As the program began, speeches from veterans and officials filled the room with stories of bravery, sacrifice, and resilience. The air was heavy with emotion, each tale a reminder of the price of freedom. Finally, the MC took the stage, his voice strong but laced with reverence. Today, we honor not just those who served, but those who gave everything for this nation. Among them is a young man whose courage and love for his country inspired everyone who knew him. It is my honor to introduce his family, here with us today. All eyes turned to the family as they rose, applause cascading through the room. The mother's hand trembled as she held onto her husband, and the younger sister stood tall, her brother's memory giving her strength. They took their seats again as the MC continued. Let me share the story of Name, a soldier whose bravery and selflessness exemplify the values we hold dear. The room grew silent as the MC recounted the soldier's life, his childhood dreams, his decision to serve, and the ultimate sacrifice he made to protect his fellow soldiers. Images appeared on the screen behind the stage, showing him in uniform, smiling with his family, and standing proudly with his platoon. The mother's tears flowed freely as the room fell into a profound hush, the weight of her son's story touching every soul present. When the MC finished, the audience erupted into a standing ovation. The sound was thunderous, reverberating through the hall. The father rose first, his head held high, his tears now a badge of honor. The mother and sister followed, their hearts swelling with pride as they took in the overwhelming show of respect. Trump approached the stage, carrying a folded American flag. His voice was steady but filled with emotion. This flag is a symbol of a nation's gratitude, he said, his gaze fixed on the family. It represents your son's courage, his sacrifice, and his unwavering love for his country. He handed the flag to the father, who accepted it with trembling hands. Thank you, the father said, his voice breaking. Thank you for remembering him. As the family returned to their seats, the younger sister opened her journal. She scribbled a line that she knew she would carry with her forever. You live on in all of us, big brother. As the event concluded, the family left with a renewed sense of purpose. Their son's story had touched countless hearts, proving that one life, lived with courage and love, could inspire a nation. Let this story remind us all to honor those who serve and make sacrifices for the greater good. Take a moment today to thank a veteran, reach out to a grieving family, or simply express gratitude. Small gestures create ripples that honor the legacies of heroes like this soldier. Together, we can ensure they are never forgotten